Thank you for coming. Before the meeting officially begins, we have a 1-minute video.
Try to have more money or be more spiritual, but the easiest way is violence. Insignificant small people are poor because they get drunk and beat their wives. Behind those closed doors are families full of lies. Children grow up with beaten up mothers being their normality. When will this circle stop? And we can live in a world with no insanity. Don't say it's none of your business and leave. Please don't tell me they shouldn't fear, and they have the voice to scream, if there isn't no one who would hear.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming today to hear our distinguished panel discuss the problems that is still pervasive in our community and is of great current concern to the National Council of Jewish Women, LA. Since 1909, NCJW LA has assisted women, children, and families in need and has been a powerful force for change, for community service, and social action. We have consistently honored our mission, tackling the often complex challenges of the day, such as reproductive rights, race and gender equality, health care, gun violence, human trafficking, in addition to domestic violence. We hope you will join us in our continued commitment to educate. We thank the members of the West Hollywood Women's Advisory Board for their continued partnership and for co-sponsoring this event. We welcome Nadia Sutton, who is representing them today. And you can recognize her, she's wearing orange. We are also honored to acknowledge Fabian Wesson, who's representing State Senator Darrell Steinberg, and Sandra Mura, who's representing Police Chief Charlie Beck, and the other assorted police members who are here today. Thank you. Domestic violence is not a recent phenomenon. 5 centuries ago, Henry VIII became the epitome of and the most famous practitioner of domestic violence. Witness his 6 hapless wives, 2 of whom, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, he beheaded. Catherine of Aragon and Anne of Cleves, each of whom he divorced after a few fractious years. Jane Seymour, who allegedly died after childbirth, and finally, Catherine Parr, who was forced to marry Henry, whom she hated, but she survived him for 4 years, tumultuous years. Henry was also an equal opportunity abuser who beheaded friends, enemies, cardinals, and political rivals, another repugnant perpetrator of violence. Unfortunately, although Henry is long gone, his many successors are still with us today. Many of us have personally known victims, and all of us have been exposed to countless stories in the media. Once again, we enthusiastically welcome Sandy Banks, who is our moderator today. I know you have a packet of biographies, but I just wanted to say a few words about Sandy in particular at this time. During her 34 years at the LA Times, Sandy Banks has served as a reporter, an editor, a columnist, an editorial writer, and director of the newspaper's internship program. I washed my hands and I can't do a thing with it. Hold on. That's it. I'm sorry. She was on the team that was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for her coverage of the LA riots in 1992. But she is best known for her twice-weekly personal commentaries, which offer us insights, entertainment, inspiration, and sometimes infuriate us all at once. Sandy has won recognition from the National Council of Jewish Women and many other organizations. She's taught journalism at USC, at Cal State Northridge, and is frequently a commentator on CNN, PBS, and NPR. She's one of the principal reasons that I still subscribe to the LA Times. Please join us in welcoming a very special friend. And I wanted to just make one other note, please. We need to thank Ruth Williams, our Director of Advocacy, for her hard work. And then you'll notice in your packet, there's a white card and a pen if you have questions to ask our distinguished panel. And we also will collect yellow evaluation forms. And there is a petition dealing with domestic violence that we would like you to sign. We send these to our legislators, and we hope that you will join us in signing this petition. You may do it here, you may take one home, you may do it online. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for having me, and thank you mostly for taking up this issue and all your advocacy that you do on behalf of women. I've written about this. I'm going to do a very brief intro because we have fascinating people. I've been listening to them in the back room for a while, and so I've learned a lot, and I want them to be able to share it all with you. It's just, first of all, some statistics, I guess, just to kind of set the stage for what we're talking about, the scope of what we're talking about, because for as enlightened as we are today, I think domestic violence is still a hidden and kind of an under-the-radar issue. I was really struck a few years ago, and this will always stay with me. I wrote about a young woman who had been killed by an ex-husband who had a restraining order against him and violated it and was in jail and was let out on bail and immediately kidnapped her on the way to work and killed her. She'd done all the things right, everything she was supposed to do. After that, someone who had worked with her held a big meeting at the West Covina Women's Center. And this woman that had died was a working class young black woman. The woman that held the session was a middle class, older woman, very older woman. And the people that turned out, there were a range of people, and they talked about the problem and then invited people to share or talk. And there was a line out the door of women, every age, every race, talking about people they'd known who'd been victims or victimization in their own lives. And there were some women, I remember there was a 77-year-old woman standing there crying, talking about something she'd never shared before with her husband years ago and what she had endured for so many years. And it really brought home that this is not an issue of class, it's not an issue of race, it's not an issue of women who can't do better, don't know better, It's an issue that can affect anybody. There are 1.5 million women who are victimized every year. A third of the women who are killed by homicide in this country are killed by their domestic partners. About 100% of children in homes with domestic violence witness or hear the abuse, so that's what they grow up with. And a woman is more likely to be injured by domestic violence than by cancer, stroke, or heart attack. So with that kind of perspective in mind, we want to, I think, go first to, we have Monica from the LAPD who can introduce herself and tell you about what she does and talk about kind of the public safety dimensions of the problem. And they're the first, the first responder and the first people that are called to step in a case like this often, so she can share her perspective, what they see in the streets and what it means for the rest of us.
Thank you, Sandy. My name is Monica Quijano, and I have the good fortune of being the domestic violence coordinator for our agency, which means I get a chance to work with a lot of different agencies, community service providers, and look at what we as law enforcement do in response to the issue of domestic violence. So I kind of wanted to give you a little bit of a perspective of how law enforcement has evolved with its perception of domestic violence. So, like was mentioned earlier, way back in the day, it was a private family matter. Everything was kept behind closed doors. It was one of those don't ask, don't tell type of stuff. If neighbors heard screaming, doors were closed, everything was kept under wraps, law enforcement was never truly involved. And if we did involve ourselves, it was basically as a noise response, or if eventually somebody was murdered as a result of being the issue of domestic violence. Somewhere between the 80s and 90s, law enforcement started getting a new insight. Part of that was as a result of lawsuits, because we realized that we were doing it wrong. And sometimes it requires that lawsuit in order for people to learn that they're not doing things the way that they're supposed to. And so law enforcement started recognizing domestic violence as a crime and started documenting and putting mandates in place that were going to require law enforcement to respond and take appropriate action at the scene of a domestic violence incident. Again, it was relatable only to that victim at the time. It wasn't this global perspective about how domestic violence impacts everybody long term. It was the initial incident that law enforcement would respond to and document and do preliminary referrals and then prosecute. Today we look at domestic violence from a law enforcement perspective in a very different light, and I think a lot of that comes from just the enlightenment of working with partnerships with the community service providers, advocacy groups, and the public in general. With education comes enlightenment, obviously, and we look at it now because domestic violence doesn't stay behind closed doors. And if we look at any given day, I'm sure most of you watch the news, read the paper, Google your emails, but within any given day, you're going to see some incident that's playing out, whether it be a barricaded suspect, which most barricaded suspect calls typically involve a family in crisis. It's not the bank robbery gone bad. You'll see the murder-suicides that are playing out in mass quantities. And I think as a result of what we're seeing, we realize it isn't just that one family that's being impacted. And now with science coming into play, we're realizing the impact of those neural pathways not being fully developed within children that are in the midst of these homes, and how that's manifesting itself long-term out in the public schools, out in society long-term. So I just wanted to kind of draw that point home. Back on October 12th, 2011, so we just unfortunately celebrated this anniversary, but Scott DeKay rocked into the Salon Meritage Hotel salon out in Seal Beach and began executing people. Why? Because his marriage had ended, and there was an issue of continuous court proceedings that were causing them, and it was a child custody issue. But the impact of domestic violence didn't stay behind that closed door any longer. It wasn't even in the courts anymore. He took it to the streets. And something that was significant for me as a law enforcement officer who wears a badge and who wears this uniform as my profession, the gentleman that was shot outside, the only reason why he was killed was because the suspect believed he was an off-duty or an undercover police officer. Had nothing to do with the fact that, you know, he was concerned about witnesses being left behind. And with that, I kind of wanted to draw the little nexus about DV being one of the most dangerous crimes that we as law enforcement respond to. And when we say that, I mean, law enforcement responds to numerous calls. There's many high-risk radio calls that come out on any given day. Domestic violence traditionally is probably the #1 call for service in most agencies. I know for us, it's very high up on the radar. But domestic violence is all about power and control. And when law enforcement responds into somebody's home who's in the midst of crisis, who's trying to assert that control in their home, and law enforcement is intervening, what they're doing is they're removing that control from them. So that is the critical moment that most abusers and most offenders will choose to either go along with the program and listen to law enforcement and participate in the process, or fearing that they're going to lose complete control and everybody's going to know what's going on behind those closed doors and all the secrets are going to come out, the potential for losing control of their spouse. Now the fight becomes at its most critical junction, and that's where we find the most critical incidents of us getting injured. And I just want to throw a few FBI statistics out. Between 1996 and 2009, 771 law enforcement officers were murdered in the line of duty. That's about 54 a year. 14% of those were murdered responding to domestic violence radio calls. Majority were murdered as a result of being ambushed or unprovoked attacks. Again, law enforcement, we're trained, we understand that we're walking into a volatile situation. However, we don't know where that individual is. You know, so what we try to do is we try to educate our officers. Yes, that's a very critical moment for us as we walk into these homes. We walk into these situations where emotions are running high, but these victims are living in this situation every single day. These children are living in this home every single day, and this has become their norm. So we try to use those things to kind of draw that information. Just a few statistics. One of the other things that there's a current study going on through Washington looking at the issue of those that attack officers and having the domestic violence criminal history. And the reason why we look at that is because, again, that whole power and control, not wanting to lose control of a situation, that's when it becomes that critical moment for law enforcement responding into these situations. But, you know, Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Officer Rod Bradway was killed on September 20th responding to a domestic disturbance call. And it was as he was walking up and responding to a woman screaming for help behind closed doors. Herbert Prophet, retired sheriff who had an extensive law enforcement career, was shot and killed in his driveway after he's retired from law enforcement by someone he put in jail 40 years ago on a domestic violence case. Sergeant Stephen Kenner, 32-year veteran of Bismarck, North Dakota, shot and killed when responding to a domestic violence disturbance call. That was in July of 2011. August of 2013, Sergeant Mike Wilson of Charlotte County, Florida Sheriff's Office, killed by a shooter who ambushed him as he was approaching the scene of a domestic violence call. Again, the anticipation of losing that control pushes people to their limits. It's the most critical incident that we ever respond to. One that deeply impacts us who wear this uniform. We lost one of our officers back in February of 2004, and that was Officer Ricardo Lizarraga. Him and his partner were working in Newton at the time, and the domestic violence call came out in '77. And they responded at 12:45, and they met with the victim who had told them what was taking place. They followed her to her apartment around 12:51, and because her boyfriend did not want to leave the residence. And as they were going in to go take control of the situation and see what was transpiring, fearing that he was going to lose all control, he broke free, went to a room, armed himself, and he shot and killed our officer. And as a patrol officer and as anybody who's ever worked in that capacity, there's nothing worse than hearing that call come out. So we get it. We understand how dangerous it is, because we walk that and do that every day. And so it's our commitment as a law enforcement agency to meet those needs of the victims, because we have a vested interest in it for their safety as well as our own.
And we're going to, everybody's going to talk about their area, and then we're going to take questions in general, and there are white cards going around if you want to write questions that you want to make sure are answered. And thank you for that, Monica. It seems to me as a reporter that a lot has changed in the way, the law enforcement perspective. I did a ride-along not too long ago with officers who talked about how now they are required by law in a domestic violence case to make an arrest if someone alleges a physical act, and where before it was always he said, she said, you don't have bruises, I didn't see it. But the flip side of that is now some women get nervous when they get there and say, well, he didn't really hit me, because they don't know, they wanted to stop it, but they don't know that they want, dad to go to jail. So it becomes it's become much more complicated in ways that we have to, grapple with in terms of helping, women to understand that this may be a short-term kind of hardship if he goes to jail, but, think about long-term what you're doing if you back down when the officers get there. Next, we're going to go to the next step in the process. Eve Sheedy is with the City Attorney's Office, and they review about 11,000 cases of domestic violence every year, which is more than some entire states do. So she's going to talk to you about their perspective and what happens at that point in the process.
Excuse me. Good afternoon. People can hear me? Am I projecting? Okay. Thank you for having me. I want to say hello to people in the audience I know, and for those of you I don't know, I'm glad you're here. I do domestic violence policy work at the LA City Attorney's Office. I don't carry caseload anymore, although in my past I have carried domestic violence caseloads and done a number of trials. We are extremely fortunate in Los Angeles to have a new city attorney, Mike Fewer, who is very, very dedicated to the issue of domestic violence and to moving programs and policies supporting victims of domestic violence and their families further into safety. My office prosecutes only misdemeanor crimes and only crimes that occur within the city limits. So LAPD crimes that are misdemeanors are prosecuted by the LA City Attorney's Office. It gets very complicated because we have incorporated areas, unincorporated areas in the county, but as far as the city goes, that's how it works. The majority of domestic violence crimes across the country are prosecuted as misdemeanors. And so we read about horrible homicide cases in domestic violence, and it's critical that those cases remain in the news in order to keep awareness up. But most people, the majority of people who are actually victimized and abused, are abused on what would be called a misdemeanor level. Now that comes with sort of a caveat within Los Angeles. My office covers sort of a variety of cases. We have cases which are a minor level of violence that could be someone is pushed or shoved, or it can be a very serious case that is for a number of very valid reasons not filed by the district attorney's office as a felony. So we also have cases where people are very severely injured. We have cases with very seriously dangerous defendants with prior records. So we've run the gamut. But importantly, for each story that you may read in the paper, that may not be the story that's impacting your friend, your neighbor, your relative. But that doesn't mean that the pain or the shame or any of the, I'm having a senior moment, but anything that occurs because of abuse isn't impacting that same person, someone else who is not subject to a very high level of violence. Oftentimes, I went to a conference once, and for someone, I've been in this field for a very long time, and I watched a group of women talk about the violence that had occurred to them, and it was some of the worst violence I've ever heard. Horrible, horrible, horrible cases. People, pregnant women having been stomped on, people being shot and thrown out of cars. Horrible, one after the other. Not many, they were all hospitalized for a long time, very serious injury. When each one of those women talked about the domestic violence, not one of them mentioned physical pain. None of them. They talked about the betrayal, they talked about the emotional pain, they talked about those kind of things. So that I'm certainly not minimizing the importance of us looking at physical injury, but domestic violence is so much more than that. And it impacts so much more whether or not there is a high level of physical injury. So in my office, if we deal with someone who may, only have a black eye or only have a red mark, that case is as important as any other case. And if that's your friend or your family member or yourself, the pain and the what you're feeling and what you're going through is shockingly similar to somebody who's undergoing a much higher level of violence. So it's something that has many, many personal dimensions that are defined not only by what you can see on the outside, but to a large degree what's happening on the inside. So back to my office, we have a family violence unit which handles our most serious cases, and those lawyers travel to our branch courts to do those serious cases, and then the majority of our cases are handled by our deputies in our various branches. Unfortunately, I cringe a little bit when I hear people talk about people going to jail in LA County because our jails are very overcrowded, and we oftentimes, particularly, unfortunately, in misdemeanors, whether or not they be serious or not, often really people don't serve the sentences that they are sentenced to. So a lot of times we look to remedies that are not incarceration based. People, I'm not going to go into a big penal code lecture, but people have to go to a batter's treatment program that lasts a year, and there are other remedies. And in fact, many victims don't want people going to jail per se, but they really want to live within that relationship without the violence, if that's a possibility. I do want to say one of the benefits of having our new city attorney is that in addition to strengthening our prosecution program, he's looking at these issues in a broader context. And so we're developing some programs that go beyond just what we can do in a courtroom. For example, one of the things he's done is appointed someone in our office to be let's get the name, I think it's the Firearm Prevention Coordinator, I think that's the title. But one of the projects he's working on is to ensure that when someone is charged with a crime, domestic violence crime, the court issues what's called a criminal protective order as part of that proceeding, which prevents the person from being able to possess any firearms. There are a lot of issues that go along with trying to recover those firearms and this and that, and whether or not people are paying attention to those issues. So we are working with LAPD to develop new programs to ensure that those accused of domestic violence or who have committed domestic violence, who are prohibited possessors of firearms, that we are going to collect those firearms. So that's one program. Another issue which is near and dear to my heart, because I've been working strongly on it for the last 3 or 4 years, is the connection of domestic violence and gang violence. And what that does is really sort of steps back to look at a cycle of violence that's beyond an individual relationship. But if you really start asking the questions, and I'm not talking about the gang members who are really so seriously violent that they're sort of people who have to be in prison for everybody to be safe, but there's a large population of people in our community who are gang affiliated who are really not that dangerous. And so they are gang affiliated very often. Once you start asking the question, why did they go to look for a family? Because their family of origin was one where there was violence, child sexual abuse, and other things which forced them out into the community. Then they become violent in the community, they have their new relationship, that relationship has family violence, that child is raised, as Monica was saying, in a household where there's violence, and we go on and on. So when we look at cycles of violence, we look not only at the individual domestic violence relationship, but how do those cycles of violence play out in the community, and what do we need to do to really get to the heart of that in order to really try to make our community safer. So that's one project that we work on both through my office and through the LA City DV Task Force. So the other thing I want to say is this: domestic violence, as you'll see by this group, is multidimensional and a complex issue. One of the benefits that we have in LA is if you take this panel, we know each other, we're friends, I think, outside of even our particular professional relationships, and we have a very strong network of resources. I can do certain things, Monica can do certain things, Terra, everybody down the line has a different role to play, but we work very well together, and we're all resources to you. So I urge you to, I don't know exactly what's in your packets, but get our contact information, and we really are, I'm going to speak for everybody, we really can, we are here to help you, and we really can help you. And if we can't personally help you, then we can find someone who can. So you're lucky, we're all lucky to have that community, but if we're really going to address domestic violence, we're going to do it collaboratively, we're not going to do it individually. So,
that was a great look at the legal end, and thank you. And it made me think, though, that of all the cases that don't get to the prosecution criminal point, where there are thousands of women and men who take out restraining orders regularly to protect themselves against violence that may be kind of nascent violence. They're being stalked, they're being threatened, he's bombarding me with text messages, whatever. And that's another thing that I hope, in fact, I don't know, Robin may be able to talk about that. She's talking about the media kind of aspect and how this is perceived, how domestic violence is perceived as an issue by the public, and kind of how the media shapes that. But also there is this kind of unseen, wave of people who are trying to protect themselves through the legal system, and that through restraining orders, and that has its own kind of hazards and blessings, that go with that. All right, Robin's going to talk to us a little bit.
Sure. My name's Robin Sachs. I'm a little bit of a woman with many different hats, so I'm going to try to smush them all into one right now and kind of and not mess up my hair. That's why she's the writer. She has these pretty analogies. First of all, just by way of background, I was a prosecutor for 15 years, 13 of which was in the LA County DA's office, and 2 of which were in Riverside County DA's. And I started in both DA's offices in '97. So that was, if you go back to 1997, you may remember a little case that was going on that changed to me, forever changed the landscape of domestic violence. And if you don't know, that was the O.J. Simpson case. And that was right when I started. And right when I started in the DA's office, from the perspective of a DA, you did not want to go to that unit. Like if you were assigned to the DV unit, you were in trouble or something, or you did something wrong, because it was that unit that everyone was watching. It was that unit that you could only screw up. It was the unit, you were in the unit that if something, somewhere, somehow, someone got hurt, it was going to be written in the LA Times, and it was going to be, you know, your name, your reputation, and the entire DA's office reputation. It was a very scary place to be. So naturally, who wanted to be there but me? And I did want to be there because I felt like, you know, this was an area that, as Monica was talking about kind of this change, there may have been some little tiny changes that, you know, particularly in law enforcement, that changes that law enforcement knew, those changes really hadn't found their way to kind of regular life yet. And it was a big pendulum swing at that time. That was like the rules they were talking about.
We call it the OJ.
Yeah,
I said we call it the OJ rule. Yeah.
Right. There literally are evidence code sections that were, you know, very much based out of, you know, Cole Brown Simpson's journal. Hearsay is allowed in as a form of testimony based on journal writings. 911 calls. All these, you know, witnesses not available for court, but could be still their testimony that could still be used. All these laws changed in 1997 to make domestic violence prosecution easier, because it was a very difficult kind of prosecution. And the reason I was personally interested in it, and it's kind of a crazy story, but I felt like it was a lot like gang violence. So it's funny that people look at it the same way, because I felt like it was a lot like gang violence, because in a lot of ways, from the prosecutor perspective, DV victims were not very pleasant necessarily to deal with. Because by the time the arrest had already occurred, and by the time the file made its way to the DA's office, the victim and perpetrator had reconciled, and they both hated me. And no one was going to cooperate. And they had already recanted, they were already lying, and I was their mutual enemy. And here I am thinking, I'm just trying to protect you. You know, I'm just trying to do what's right to help you and to help your kids. But by the time they got to me, they hated me. So it was somewhat of a thankless job. But when you realize, like in gang work, that you're really protecting people who don't realize they need protection, or protecting people who may not want to be protected. It's almost like, you know, being a mama bear to a bunch of kids. You're doing things that need to be done, and you don't care what they think about you, and you just do your job. And that was when the DA's office had this philosophy that it's, you know, the victim doesn't get to decide whether or not charges are pressed. The case, if you ever look at a criminal complaint, it's very clear. The people of the state of California versus the defendant. The victim in a case is, for better or worse, is a witness, a complaining witness. They are not a party to the case. That's both a relief, should be a relief to victims. They don't have to have that pressure of that they're bringing this case. They're not bringing this case. The case is brought by the county, and the county makes the determination of whether or not a crime has been violated and whether or not that person should be perpetrated. So there I went for years and years, going to court, case by case, one trial, one victim, you know, one jury at a time, trying to find justice. And I would very often go to court and listen to these horrific stories that we've heard, and be amazed that I'm sitting here in a courtroom that was completely empty. OJ wasn't there, so there were no cameras. And I was struck by the absence of people, not only on behalf of the victim and the victim's family, but also on behalf of the defendant and the defendant's family. I mean, the courtrooms were literally open. It was empty. It would be me, the defense attorney, the judge, the deputy in the courtroom, the defense attorney, and the jury, and in a completely empty courtroom. And every day I go, if people really knew what was really going on every single day, people would be outraged. People would not believe how many cases we have. No one could imagine that this happened. And so there I did my work, you know, onward for many, many years, and I decided that I was going to start writing. Anybody who's ever spent any time in the criminal courthouse, you know how many hours away you wither away. The wheels of justice move like molasses. It's a very, you know, hurry up, get to court, only to wait for 4 hours, right? So I started bringing my laptop to court. And I literally, now at the time I was married, so in court I was Robin Katzenstein for the people. My maiden name is Sachs. And so I decided, you know what, I'm going to start writing. And I'm going to start writing about some of the things that I see, and I'm going to do it under Robin Sachs and kind of vent and see what happens with this. And then I kind of enjoyed writing. Plus, I had hours to write. I mean, literally hours. I mean, and every time I saw something outrageous in court, I'd be like, I can't, you know. And from the mundane and the very serious, you know, I can't believe she wore that to court today. To you know, I can't believe the judge did this. You know, and I was kind of calm. And I started developing a voice, and I thought, you know, how great it would be if I could just blast what was in my head to the world. And right about that time, I decided I had a 4-year-old and I had 2 stepsons. And I used to always feel bad for them because they had a mom who was a DA, and they always felt like they could never get away with anything. So I decided that I was going to write, this is a way long story to get to my point, but I'm telling you anyway. I decided I was going to write a kitschy book about everything I learned about parenting I learned in court. And so it was going to be this book that was supposed to be kind of funny, but true parenting advice. Like, don't ask a question you don't know the answer to. How can you tell if you know your kid's lying? The 4th Amendment search and seizure doesn't apply to your kids, so go feel free to snoop. And I was starting to, I would go to court, and I would take every single thing that was kind of a court rule, and I would translate it into a parenting rule. And lo and behold, crazy, I Love Lucy Robin ends up sending a proposal out to a bunch of agents, and I got picked up to write this darn book. And someone said, you know, we love this book. Great, let's go write the book. Can you get yourself on television? Because if you could get yourself on television, then we'll give you an advance for your book and whatever. So I went to the DA and I told them what I was doing, and they were like, cool, it was fine. And they said, you can go on television so long as you don't talk about any LA cases. So, okay, no problem. Now, at this point, so I did, you know, I got in touch with my most media savvy defense attorney, media whores out there, and begged for them to put my name in if they ever needed a prosecutor's voice. And it was right about the time of Brittany and Lindsay and everything beginning. And I'd get calls on those cases, but I couldn't talk about it because I was in the DA's office. And then all of a sudden, Casey Anthony happened. It was like, thank you, Florida. It's not LA, it wasn't related to LA, and I was able to go talk about it. And so I went on television, and what I realized in 3 minutes of being on television, not only did they poof me up and make me look really pretty, but in 3 minutes I got off the air, and my phone was buzzing and beeping and emailing, whatever, and I'm like, holy shit. People watch this stuff. Like, people watch television. Who knew? I don't have time to watch television. And what I realized was in 3 minutes of talking about Casey Anthony, people I hadn't spoken to in 35, 38, whatever old I was at the time, years, were contacting me, not to mention all the people I didn't know. And I thought, 3 minutes of television, I could reach the world, or 13 years in the DA's office and no one has a clue. And so I said, you know what, if you really want to advocate for justice, you've got to get yourself on that television screen, because that's where people watch and what people hear. So it was like I drank the Kool-Aid, and I did feel a little weird because I'm a born and raised Angelino, and I felt like I was now a Kansas girl wanting to be an actress, right? I was like, I'm going to Hollywood. And so what I wanted to do was get on television, and there came a point where the Conrad Murray trial was Michael Jackson case, you may recall. I had to make a decision, basically. I was on a leave of absence to finish books anyway, but I had to make a decision as to whether or not I was going to stay in the office, because I could not, the rule was I couldn't talk about LA cases. And once I decided that I wanted to talk about LA cases, then I had to leave the DA's office, which I did, and I did with a tear in my eye. I am a prosecutor at heart. I love my job. I love being a DA because it is about also assessing. If you're really passionate as a prosecutor about what you're doing, you are also thinking about the defendant and the effects on the defendant and what's going to happen to a family, and you're thinking about what's best for an entire situation. But through this process, I then ended up started working for various media companies. I've also stayed and still have a tiny, super tiny law practice where I take on very select cases. But I have become very schooled in the power of the media and what I have seen. So I've kind of sat in all of these different chairs in some ways, and seen the different shifts within the domestic violence community. I've seen how it's received, both how law enforcement has made all of these amazing strides and changes and very, very proactive, how the DA's office and the city attorney's office has made it a priority year after year, not only in how they create policy for dealing with crime, but also in terms of how the resources that they now provide for victims that have never been there through Marcy's Law, making sure victims have the right to make a statement, trying to find resources for victims. I mean, there's been a tremendous strides in a lot of different ways. But there's also been, just like every great thing, a lot of unintended consequences, a lot of effects that you would never have thought, pendulum shifts and swifts to different directions that have created new issues. One of those are, now I'm seeing the result of the, as soon as one advocacy group gets really strong and powerful, no doubt there will be an opposite advocacy group trying to counter the actions. So here you have domestic violence really becoming to the forefront. Everyone's thinking that we've come a long way and it's a great thing. And then people recognizing domestic violence is a big issue, and all of a sudden you start having a very loud and active father's rights movement out there, now utilizing domestic violence and switching domestic violence, the dynamic of domestic violence, and really advocating on behalf of dads by doing their own advocacy, suggesting prevalent use of suggestibility of witnesses, prevalent use of parental alienation syndrome. I'm not saying that there's not good things that the father's rights movement does. Okay, I believe kids in healthy relationships need their mom and they need their dad. And good healthy relationships, I have no preference. My daughter lives in a split family. My ex-husband and I have 50-50 custody. He's a great dad. I do not believe all kids should belong with mom in any way, shape, or form. However, it drives me crazy to see criminal court systems, family court systems misused to facilitate a family law case. And the newest weapon, in my opinion, in domestic violence and child abuse is the court system. The court system is the new gun, it's the new punch, and it's the system that not only can hurt the spouse or the partner, but it hurts the children. It leaves lasting effects. It's now placing, primary aggressors are getting custody of kids where they shouldn't, just as a tool to get back to a spouse. It's draining people's financial resources, and the group that really has not come as far along as everybody here at this table has is the bench, the judges. They are the one group of people that if I were to say here, we need to work to educate, it's to educate the bench, because they are just not quite as advanced as it seems as some of the folks that I see here there. So one of the things that I look at is the media. I know a lot of people think, oh, media, bad word, and maybe a lot of the time that is the case. I look at as Monica says that the police are the first responders, I look at the media as the last responders, and being the court of last resort. Not every single case is a media case, but certainly there are cases that the public would benefit from knowing. And there is a partnership that we can have in a healthy, productive, ethical way to make sure that we are doing good for our society and for each other. So don't discount the media as being poo-poo, and also don't assume that they're always going to be interested. They need to be educated too. A lot, the same, staunchy, old fat white guys that run the rest of the world are the same staunchy old white fat guys that run media. So it takes people like all of you to educate those people so that we can educate the world. And the one thing I can say about domestic violence, and I'm sure Santi would agree with this, the one benefit, I guess, if you were to say that there is a benefit, from a media perspective, domestic violence is a natural media good story. Okay? There's people, there's emotion, there's pain and hurt and a story. And so if you can get the strength to share your story, you kind of are a little bit ahead of some of the other stories out there that just aren't that, sexy in terms of media coverage. I mean, someone getting in a car accident is not nearly as good TV as a relationship issue. And I say that not to, as a shallow thing. I say that as there's, know where you have strength, and that may be a place where sharing your story is something that would interest the media and can help effectuate change. And I'm here to be a resource for that.
Thank you. And just to chime in on that, I think probably the media is as unenlightened as the bench in many cases. And the downside of kind of media coverage is that it often tends to kind of perpetuate the stereotypes of the kind of, difficult, broken down, helpless victim who, just isn't very smart and doesn't know anything. And it instead of putting the focus on the batterer, who is the person who should be feeling ashamed and be, called out, as opposed to the women. I think it helps in terms of the media perspective. I do a lot of work with Genesee Center, which is in South LA. It's one of the oldest domestic violence centers in South LA, and Halle Berry is their spokeswoman. And she's funded some of their shelters, and she speaks, on their behalf quite often. And when you can have Halle Berry come out and say, yes, I was a victim of domestic violence, I understand it, and these women are like me, it kind of changes the whole dynamic of the situation. So I think that's part of what we in the media need to do, and that is, to kind of broaden our perspective and to look at it as a continuum, and as Eve said, is the emotional impacts of it beyond just covering it when somebody gets killed, because but looking at the corrosive effects on the men and the women in domestic violence. And we've talked about it, man and woman, as kind of a static thing. And now we have Terra, who's going to talk to us kind of about a different perspective in domestic violence with the LGBT community.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. And first off, thank you to NCJW for having me on this panel. I always love the panels that are put on here. I'm very appreciative of getting the opportunity to speak to all of you. So my name is Terra Slavin. I'm the lead staff attorney at the LA Gay and Lesbian Center, and I specifically manage their domestic violence legal advocacy project, and have been doing that for nearly the last 8 years. So just kind of taking a step back, one of the things that I wanted to do is run through a few statistics, but I won't make it statistic heavy, but just kind of for framing purposes. So the CDC actually in this last year released its first ever study that asked about sexual orientation in their national sexual and intimate violence, intimate partner violence and sexual violence survey. And what they found is that the prevalence, the lifetime prevalence of physical assault, rape, or stalking for bisexual women was 61%, for lesbians was 44%, bisexual men 37%, heterosexual women 35%, heterosexual men 29%, and gay men 26%. And those numbers slightly shifted at severe intimate partner violence when they asked specifically about severe forms of intimate partner violence. What we say is it historically happens at about the same rate, 1 in 4 to 1 in 3 relationships kind of across the course of the lifetime. What we are seeing, however, is that there was just a new study released last month that those numbers may be higher for LGBTQ youth. And so the National Institute of Justice just released a study, and it found that 43% of LGBTQ youth reported being victims of physical dating violence, compared to 29% of heterosexual youth, and 23% reported sexual coercion, compared to 12% of heterosexual youth. I think the underlying premise is it's an issue, and it's largely an invisible issue, both within the larger community as well as within the LGBT community, right? So what we need education, we need discussions, we need conversations, and we need to be acknowledging this as the problem that it is. 22 people were reported in basically news media in 2012 died of domestic violence in LGBT relationships, right? And that was released by the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs, just released its annual 2012 numbers for the year in terms which collates all of the IPV incidents in LGBT relationships. So just what are some of the barriers? One of the things, I think on the very just base level of it, it's, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, and, it is a reality that we still have survivors that when they go out and get assistance, they are actively discriminated against, right? They are told that they won't fit in, that other people wouldn't be comfortable with them there, that, this doesn't happen to people in the community, right? So I think we have just a sheer level of bias that is still out there, although shifting. But I actually think that the thing that is maybe more sort of rampant, which is heterocentrism, right? Which is the belief, often subconscious, that everyone exists in heterosexual relationships. And this, we heard it, and I completely respect all the members of the panel, but we hear it in the way we talk about it, right? We consistently talk about domestic violence as male batterers, female survivors, and cisgender heterosexual relationships, right? It is every day when a person is sort of going for service provision, whether it's to their doctor, to their therapist, trying to access legal services, going in and having to explain, that assumption that is put on them that they exist in a heterosexual relationship and having to either out themselves, disclose, or determine the level of safety and whether they're able to do that in that situation. So I think all of that kind of plays into the barriers. And then I think also because of the way and the nature, I can say about 50% of the people I work with are male survivors, right, approximately. And also many trans survivors, both female and male. But I personally work with more female trans survivors. And it can be the barriers to just getting any services, right? And what that can look like in terms of calling places and asking, or, because not everyone can come down to Hollywood to the one center, right, to get their services. People should be able to get their services wherever they live, right? And should be able to access resources. A couple other things, just in terms of both the fear of discrimination, I also think, the fear of being outed. And, that can have a lot of consequences for people wherever they're at. So we talked a little bit about the numbers for LGBTQ youth, but we still know that about 40% of homeless youth in LA, right, are LGBTQ, which is vastly disproportionate to the population. So literally a batterer being able to say, I'm going to tell your classmates where there's almost universal hate violence, or I'm going to tell, your family or your parents, that could literally mean that this person's not going to have a place, to stay. And what type of power does that give to the batterer in the relationship, like their ability to control that situation? So all of those are sort of very, are challenges, and I see a lot of people here from law enforcement. I work very closely with law enforcement. I think there are many great law enforcements, but there's still also a lot of community fear, right? Yes. And the ability to access law enforcement is at times can be quite challenging and quite difficult. We see the Department of Justice has put out their statistics showing vastly higher rates of mutual arrest in same-gender domestic violence situations, almost 30 times that of heterosexual women and 10 times that of heterosexual males. So we know the likelihood of dual arrest or no arrest can really make it more difficult and just sort of allow for that continuation of abuse. Where the and if you're dealing with like a trans woman, the threat of where are they going to go? Right? Yes. Where, what facility are they going to be put in? And is that going to expose someone to further violence and further abuse if they're being, housed? And we do have actually a new a pod, which is awesome. We're one of the few places in the country. We're actually trying to address this right now. That is allowing for some separate housing and some safer environments, because this is a real issue, and we have high levels of rates of violence and re-victimization for people who are often really dealing with horrible domestic situations, and they don't have the places to turn for assistance. Yeah. I also just wanted to say it's kind of interesting, kind of in terms of the fathers' rights movement, a lot of the people who are in that arena and who are using the statistics, they really like to use the statistics coming out of the LGBT community, because we're showing these high levels of particularly of male victimization and also female perpetration, and so it tends to get used on. But then you see it also at the same information getting used by Marriage and Family Values Coalition, saying why people aren't, shouldn't be, aren't the appropriate family. And I would just put in the plug, not only is it good for people to have a mom and a father, but two moms or two fathers, or all the ways in which we sort of acknowledge a family, and a family that basically loves their child, right? And trying to create those healthy spaces where people, regardless of their identities, are being valued for the love that the family that they're making. So I'm going to keep it short so we have time for questions, but that was just my very brief spiel.
Thank you very, very much for that, Stu. It serves as a kind of course correction and a reminder, too, that we are pretty much as guilty as everybody else about thinking in this in kind of outmoded terms. So thank you for that very much.
Yes.
And next and last, we have talking about kind of the heart and soul of all this, Ava, about the kind of social issues that this presents and the emotional issues and the impact on mental health and lives and what we can do about it.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Ava Rose. I am the Director of Women Helping Women in Community Counseling and Support Services here at NCJW. And I am a therapist, and I've worked for many years with survivors, victims and survivors. And I wanted to kind of bring in a little bit the mental health perspective and to kind of talk about the mental health issues that sort of weave through all of the different disciplines that have been talking today. We've talked about the importance of the safety net that we have as providers in the community, and I think as someone who works directly with victims and survivors, I know how important it is that the full responsibility of addressing this issue doesn't fall on the person who is themselves the victim. And this is something that often happens. I think we're getting better and better at it, and I'm sure you could hear that in the talks of my colleagues up here. But there certainly, was a time not too long ago when the entire burden of making the abuse stop was placed on the person who was being victimized. There are still a lot of families who approach it that way. And we have clients here today whose families are telling them, you need to be, and I am going to use the heterosexual language because this is the client I'm talking about, but for clients, you need to be a better wife, you need to be a better mother, why are you not meeting his needs? If you were this or that, you wouldn't do it. All of that stuff still happens in families. I know none of us in this room would say that, but please know that people in the community are still hearing this from their families and from the people around them. We need to spread the word among everybody, that is really, there needs to be a deeper understanding among everybody in the community. There's also a lot of responsibility on the victims in terms of getting a restraining order. And what if a victim doesn't want a restraining order? Or, we were talking about the arrests, and the arrest is no longer the decision of the victim. That's a good thing for a lot of reasons, and although a scary thing as well. But one of the reasons is because, as we've heard, most of these cases are misdemeanors. Many of them don't get prosecuted at all, and even if a person does end up getting incarcerated, they're not typically incarcerated for long. And so what happens when all of that is over? And if the victim is the person who made the complaint, you can bet that he or she is afraid for their safety when the person is back out in the community. So there are a lot of reasons why putting the responsibility on the person who's being victimized is problematic. There's also a lot of concerns that I have as a clinician about what happens in the court. We were talking about, I think Robin was saying, it's the bench especially that needs more understanding. But I think we all need more understanding about what it is that we see when we meet with somebody who's being victimized. Because often people who are being victimized don't present in the way that you might expect. They're not necessarily presenting like Halle Berry, right? They're not necessarily, so sweet and so, scared and trembling and please help me. That's sometimes we get that presentation, but so often that's not what we see. And so I wanted to just give you a little bit of mental health perspective about some of the things that you may see and that also that professionals may see that can be very confusing. So a little bit of sort of mental health background about why a victim may not want an arrest or a restraining order, may not want to leave. I think people are very confused about, right? Why wouldn't the victim want this relationship to end? So there are two main fields of learning in my field that have really evolved a lot in the last few years. One is neuroscience. We have a lot of neuroscience information now that's helping us understand the brain and understand human behavior. And we also understand a lot about attachment and the importance of attachment in development. So I'm going to kind of just give you some basic building blocks. And these are trainings that I also like to do for people who are first responders so that they can build what they see. So one of the things that we've learned from the neuroscience is that the way that the brain is developed, and this makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, the part of our brain that is the most primal and the most primitive is the part of our brain that assesses whether or not we're safe and responds to fear and danger. And that makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, right? Because the most important thing for our survival is that we recognize danger and react to it. So what happens in the brain is that if we detect either a threat, a danger, or even worse, a life threat, our brain kicks into a whole other way of processing. And that way of processing takes over our entire system. And you know this if you've ever been afraid, where before you even realize what you're afraid of, you know your heart is pounding, right? It's sending blood to your muscles. All these changes are happening in your body to prepare you to run away, to fight or flee, right? Fight or flight is the first response that we all have to danger. And a lot of the victims who we work with are in a fight or flight state a lot of the time. So some people who we meet may present as fearful, or they may present as angry, and that's a presentation that really confuses, for example, judges. This is a victim, she should be afraid. Why is she so angry, right? Why is she so irritable? Because fight or flight is physiologically the same exact state in the body. The body is preparing itself to deal with a threat, and it can go either way. Fight is actually a more empowering response than flight. And if you can't get away, sometimes flight isn't, and fear is not an option. And so many people are in that state. So it's important to understand why that may be. Some interesting things that happen to us when we're in a fight or flight state that you may not realize, there are changes that happen in our perceptions. So one example is that we're in a fight or flight state. Our optimal range of vision is, okay, so normally if we're in what's called a social engagement state, our optimal range of vision is about, maybe not even our distance, but maybe more like our distance, or me to Sandy. The distance of social relationships. Our vision is primed for that distance. But when we're in a fight or flight state, things that are close get a little bit fuzzy in our vision, and we're actually primed to see farther out into the horizon. This is happening in our eyes, right? And the brain's processing. Why? Because if you're in danger, you need to see the predator on the horizon. It doesn't really matter if the person sitting next to you, what expression they have on their face. What matters is the danger out there. Well, they've done research, and they have found that people who are in a fight or flight state, and they can measure that by the cortisol in their system, that's the stress hormone. People who are in a fight or flight state, if you show them pictures of a neutral face, a face with a neutral expression, they will overestimate those expressions as being threatening or dangerous or angry than if you show the same pictures to people who are in a fight or flight state. So think about what that means. Somebody who is in a condition of violence or a condition of being unsafe, and this applies to people in unsafe communities as well as relationships and families, is more likely to interpret your expression as being threatening. They're less likely to see you as being friendly. So you think you're offering a helping hand, you're a supportive person, you're a nice police officer, but they don't see that. Their eyes are literally not registering that in your face. So that's really important to know. There are also changes that happen in hearing, and this is fascinating as well. Our normal optimal range of hearing is the range of the human voice, and typically a little bit in the higher range. When we're in a state of rest and digest and social engagement, we're very primed to hear sort of the higher vocal register. When we're in a fight or flight state, our hearing drops down to the lower register, listening for, again, the sounds of predators. And so low, rumbling sounds can be very threatening. That can apply to the male voice, so that victims may be more reactive to a low male voice than to a higher voice. And it also means that low sounds in the environment, like the hum of computers and machines or cars or the things that are on the street, if a police officer is interviewing someone on the street, a lot of those sounds may kick the person's nervous system up into high gear. When our nervous system is in high gear, in that high alert state, it's also very difficult for us to engage in cognitive processing and decision making. So imagine somebody who's in fight or flight all the time is having trouble making good decisions all the time. And we ask ourselves, why doesn't she do, or why doesn't he do X, Y, and Z? Well, there are a lot of reasons why, and some of that is neurological. So that's the fight or flight state. Then there's something that happens that's even worse than that. Fight or flight is a state of mobilization. That happens when we have a threat that we can respond to. But what happens when you are facing a life threat and you have no opportunity to fight back and you have no opportunity to flee? Our brains are designed to go into a shutdown response. And this is something that animals do, mammals and fish. Actually, there's a fish that when it's out in the ocean and a big predator comes that it can't get, there are many fish that do this, and they can't get away and they can't fight back. Their whole organism powers down, basically. They go into almost like a coma state. And often the predator will pass them over for dead. And so it's a survival mechanism. We do that too. And so how many of you seen somebody who's been in a chronic trauma who's kind of in that like zoned out, fuzzy vision, not really registering what's happening? I'm sure you guys have seen that, right? That happens to a lot of our victims because they have been in this state of threat for so long with no opportunity to get away, no ability to fight back, and they just shut down. And so that's a presentation that's also very confusing because we expect a victim to be afraid. So what happens when someone shows up and they're just like numbed out and they're not seeming afraid? Does that mean they're not in danger? It might mean they've been in danger for so long that they've shut down. So these are some of the things that we're learning in the mental health field that I think many of my colleagues are aware of, but I think there are still many people out there sitting on the bench or first responders or therapists, even sometimes teachers, and certainly people in the community who don't know this. So I think there's a lot to do to sort of spread this information so we can all do a better job of responding to people.
Fascinating. I think we're going to teach some classes.
Yes.
That's really stuff that we don't know, and it would help inform this discussion a lot. I'm going to move to some of the questions, and some of them, so don't relax, Ava. Some of them are directly for you. First, I just want to read some comments from people too, because I think these probably reflect a lot of sentiment in the room. One woman, well, here's the I guess the one that I first read, that kind of goes straight to it, and that's, when does it end? My father was abusive, his son, my brother was abusive, my brother's son was abusive. Will his son be abusive too? Where does it end? And I think we can talk later about the role of, this one person said, I believe by getting women financially more independent, we'll have less women suffering and staying in these types of abusive situations. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. And then the one point that we all need to kind of keep in mind, and I feel like we were guilty of it up here, and that is that culturally we're in the linguistic habit of hiding the perpetrator in the violence statistics, i.e. every so many seconds a woman is beaten or sexually assaulted in the U.S. Do we have a way to shift the numbers and the focus on the statistics to the perpetrators? How about every 9 seconds a man beats up or sexually assaults a woman? Wouldn't that shift cultural And then here's some really thoughtful questions, and I'm going to put these to you, Eva, because they go to what you spoke about. Many women I have spoken to say they would rather suffer through the abuse than report it. They are afraid that the consequences when the perpetrator is released will be worse and more dangerous than the abuse. And that's actually statistically shown to be true. So what do I say to women? What do I say to that when women come? This is from somebody who works on the Women's Advisory Board, dealing with domestic violence victims. So that's one. What do I say to that when someone says, I'm scared to tell because I'm still vulnerable? And then secondly, is there a program that offers counseling to children or whole families who are victimized and suffering domestic violence, and how do you find them?
The answer to the last question is there are many, and one of them is right here. Our program, Women Helping Women, offers exactly that. We offer therapy services to victims and children. And there are many other programs in Los Angeles where we have a counseling talk line that can help connect people to programs all over the city. My thoughts about what to say, and other people on the panel may have ideas too, but I think one thing that's very important for us to say is to people who are in the situation is that they don't need to make any particular decision in order to have our support. That's something that we do as therapists all the time. Somebody can get support even if they're not ready to leave. Somebody can get support even if they're not ready to make a report. Somebody can get support even if they don't want a restraining order. There's a lot of ways that people can get support, and sometimes people need a tremendous amount of support in order to be able to figure out what else they might be able to do. I think if we can support people without bringing our own agenda to it, we can let them know that they're important. We can let them know that we don't judge them. We can let them know that they deserve better. We can let them know that we're here for them. That goes a long way, even to calm down the nervous system, going back to what I was describing earlier. If people can spend even a little bit of time letting their nervous system settle down and feeling safe, even if it's for an hour a week in a therapist's office or an hour a week having coffee with a friend, that gives their brain a little bit of a break. It gives them time to kind of rebuild their sense of self, from the inside, and maybe at some point to start to figure out if they do have other options. But I think it's important that we let that happen at the victim's own pace, because there are very real safety concerns. We can never minimize those.
One, just to follow up to, and this is last one for you, I think. For people who are victims of domestic violence for a long period of time, how does being in the fight or flight status affect them over time? Does it affect their health, and does it have permanent repercussions?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Yeah, there's a lot of research showing that there are some extremely significant health impacts of being in chronic stress. There are conditions like fibromyalgia, for example, which are thought to be connected to exactly that condition, to being in a state of chronic stress, and cortisol, changes, and the entire stress hormone system changes. There are a lot of diseases that relate to that, and also depression, is a very common outgrowth from a mental health standpoint. Anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, all of that.
This is a suggestion from someone that maybe it would help to have well-known men to get on board and be visible in spreading the word that there's no excuse for domestic violence. Just like the way that the NFL is promoting breast cancer awareness. That they could take a role in that. So that's a good idea.
Definitely.
And here's a question I'll throw open to anybody. It's a really good one. The woman who's physically battered knows she's being abused. Sometimes people know, it's obvious. But women who are being seriously emotionally abused don't know. People don't know it, and it's not obvious. Sometimes it takes a woman years to understand that when she can't socialize with whom she wants, she can't spend the money she makes, she can't do what she wants without having consequences from her partner, that is abuse and it's not normal. So the question inherent in that is I guess how we educate people and how you serve people. And I've seen this in court, in the restraining order court. Well, he's really not that bad a guy. It's only when he drinks, or he's only yells at me, or and that's minimizing it. And that women don't see that this is emotional abuse, and as somebody said, I think that's what you were saying, Monica, is that it's control. Domestic abuse is about control, and that control often starts with emotional abuse. So what can we do? How can we help women recognize that and become healthier in ways that will help resolve that? Anybody?
All right, I'll go. Well, the short answer is you guys. I think the answer is that it's public awareness. I think someone has written that human beings are the only people who override their instincts. And I think when you're in a relationship that's abusive in that way, and not physically abusive, that there's a feeling that there's something wrong. The ability of that person to reach out depends upon their friends, their family, their community, their religious organization. And so it's important, we're all in jobs where we do this. It's important for the people who are not in jobs where they do this to also create an environment where people who are feeling badly, wrong, trapped, controlled, have a means to express that without that being shameful. It goes back to that comment about the perpetrator. If someone can say, this is what's going on, it doesn't feel right to me that I can't visit my family, or their friend says to them, gee, we used to see you a lot, now we don't see you. Is there something going on? Can I help? It really comes down to that. Instead of it, the normal reaction when you have a feeling that someone may be in that relationship is to do this. And to say, well, they'll call the police, well, they'll call a hotline, well, they'll do something. But a lot of times what someone needs is the number for a hotline. If you can call as a friend or family member, you can call a hotline and talk to someone who's trained, and they'll help you to know what to say to someone. So it really depends, I think, on all of us to explain to people that that there's what they're feeling, their instinctual response is the correct one, instead of all the messages which are saying that their instinctual response is not the correct one.
Yeah. Can I just make one comment? In sexual abuse rarely starts with someone just raping someone, right? There's a process called grooming that many people may be aware of, right? They start very slowly. They spend a lot of time and energy is spent to make the sexual assault happen. It's very similar in domestic violence. It's not necessarily a hit that is the first clue that a person has. It's isolation from friends and family. It's demeaning behavior, it's outbreaks, it's control over finances, control over various things. So you have to look at those same kind of signs and symptoms as being the precursors, which is just, may not, but could be the precursors to physical abuse.
Those are both really good answers, and it goes back to, I think, what Ava said about being a friend and being the person that listens. And I think probably everybody in here has at least one friend, if it's not you yourself, who has been in a relationship where somebody's exerting too much control. And I know with my friend, I kind of said the wrong thing, like, I don't know how you're married to a man like that.
Yeah.
Which as soon as it came out of my mouth, I realized was so wrong. And I am now a much better friend. But the whole thing of, gently steering people without expressing judgment to trust themselves and to trust that emotion, and also to keep in mind one thing that I heard a judge say in a domestic violence TRO case where the woman was trying to get a restraining order, and she was kind of trying to say, well, I don't really need it now, it was just a bad day, and she was kind of back out of it. And the judge made the point that every person who has been, killed in a domestic violence case, up to the last minute when the hands were around their neck or the gun went off, they never thought it would be them. They didn't think that would happen, and that you have to evaluate the potential in the case, not just the now. And that, as Robin said, it doesn't start with a punch, it starts with something else and it works up. So I think that's a real good individual call for all of us to just be attentive and be aware and be loving in our relationships.
Can I just add one other thing too? In conjunction with all that, I think it's also important to not just talk, but to model what's important for our youth. Because there's children growing up in these homes where this is playing out. And to start that dialogue and to explain to children that this isn't what a healthy relationship looks like, and giving them those alternatives to see what healthy looks like in a relationship where there's that mutual respect. And I think giving even those that are in the midst of that domestic violence relationship, giving them the alternative to know that the power is in their hands, because we want to give them the power back. So we want to educate, but we also want to give them alternatives, and we want to show them that there are choices that can be made, and look at what life can be. And this is where we would go together and work in partnership. But I also think it's the carrying over for our youth, because that's the next generation that's going to be impacted, and we have to start now, because we want to be out of jobs somewhere down the future.
Yes. I think I'm getting the sign we're getting close to ending. But can I just, this is just one question, because it came up when we were talking privately. And this was a question from somebody on how law enforcement handles gathering information and how you build a case in a domestic violence case. And are there things that we can do to help, or if it's a friend or someone we know to counsel them? Because, sometimes a lot of time passes, and by the time they get in court, they don't remember it almost.
Yes, part of like what Robin had mentioned and exactly what Eve had mentioned, as things play out, as relationships deteriorate, to the incident of the slapping, the kicking, where law enforcement actually responds, we realize that there's been a multitude of incidents that have occurred, whether it be the financial, control, the over texting, the stalking incidents, as one partner tries to leave the relationship and the other one has destroyed property. Those are incidents that have occurred that are actually crimes and leading up to more volatile crimes. So within law enforcement, we always work in partnership, but we always ask for advocates to stress to their clients, those are all pieces of a bigger puzzle that we need in order to be able to take the case to Eve, to take the case to the district attorney's office, because it's telling their story, and only they can truly tell their story. Keeping phone records, keeping notes, taking pictures, documenting, like what was mentioned earlier about the journal, having that as being evidence as being admissible. All of those elements are critical to ensure a quality prosecution. And I'm sure, I mean, Eve, you want to tap in on for the prosecutor, that's what's going to make the case for them. And law enforcement recognizes that not everybody's ready to come forward right then and there on the very first incident. But we ask that you have a trusted friend that you can share that information with. Hand it over to somebody else if there's a fear of the abuser finding it. But making sure that there's some record on file of your story.
And just to add, I guess, and to wrap up, there's probably nothing that's more kind of the light bulb going on than for the person to read their own journal and to look at their own pictures, because as time passes and you know, the partner goes back to the nice, you know, Mr. and Miss Nice, you forget. And so keeping that record is also a way of you know, validating yourself and reminding yourself. It's like, you know, when you're out of the fight and flight and you're calm and you can look at, oh my God, this happened 3 months ago and now it's happening again. So it also gives the victim a sense of, a concrete sense of what's happening that can be empowering. Well, I want to, yes.
I just want to add one thing in the non-judgment frame. Understand that if a case doesn't get filed, it doesn't mean that a prosecutor doesn't believe someone is a DV victim. What it means is there's insufficient evidence to prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt. And those are two very different things. Prosecutor may believe that indeed the person is a victim, and that's why all of the services that are available are important. And it's important that we don't make a test. You know, oh, well, you reported it, but it wasn't filed. Oh, you don't want to leave. We don't make tests for people who say they are in abusive relationships, that we support them and try to utilize as many systems as we can, because not every system is going to fit correctly in every situation.
And for the person that did the long letter here today, I'm going to give it to you. All right, well, thank you all very much.
Please don't leave until you look at this petition to ending domestic violence. Just sign it. It's not the same. You're leaving it. It's not the same as the petition we had to sign dealing with the Army abuse. We want to thank God. It's wonderful to have a panel of 6 remarkable, beautiful, erudite women. Yes. Thank you all. Pick up the information in our lobby. We're having a remarkable conference on November 3rd. We invite your membership and your attendance. See this yellow form? Sign it and tell them how wonderful they are. Okay?